first season of Westworld dealt with the ways in which we can own our personal identity and memories rather than be the authors of our actions with free will as Season 3 did. According to the scientists in the show, what is missing from the host software is the ability to remember their traumatic past, their sufferings, which would have afforded them to possess personal identities. The creators of the show then argue in Judeo-Christian fashion that pain makes us remember the past and reminds us who we are. This is why the hosts began to identify themselves in the mirror only when they were able to remember the abuse they went through from the guests and staff of Westworld. But even without having personal identities, before they acquired the narrative self, they already had an experiential sense of self, meaning they could take a first-person perspective on their experiences. How is this possible? Husserl showed that our experience is temporal, which means that the future and the past are the background and the foreground that accompany any moment of it. It is not of something that is objectively present, but is of something that stretches through time for us pre-reflectively. Our sense of self then doesn't require a second higher-order reflection. The self doesn't see itself through a reflection in the mind, but it shows itself to the agent as it engages in the world. Each moment that has just passed is retained in consciousness like a working memory, but we can also recollect the past, represent it. This means that the temporal structure of our experience affords us to reflect on our past, and it also means that we can never coincide with ourselves through reflection in the first place, since we are always already stretched along time. Only because the hosts then already had minimal sense of selves that exist in time, they could tell their life stories. But then their authenticity became questionable when they realized that they were programmed. This is how we also feel sometimes in our everyday life. As persons, we tell stories that are based on our memories, decisions, values, and relationships with others. But how can we be sure that we are the authors of our life story if we are part of a linguistic community that has a historical dimension which we didn't choose to be born into? Moreover, our memories, decisions, and ideals constantly change, which means that in order to be the authors of our stories, we also need to know where they are heading rather than only when they began. In order to have a personal identity, it is not enough to own our past, but we also have to own our future. Heidegger shows how we can achieve that without denying the impersonal aspect of our existence. That is how the stories we want to tell about ourselves can be included in the story of our linguistic community. Dasein, Heidegger's term for a human being, existentially always understands the world in some way or another, which affords it possibilities it can project itself toward in the future. This means that existential time is oriented toward the future, toward what more one could experience and achieve. Dasein is never present to itself and the entities it faces, but an ongoing openness towards possibilities it could witness and fulfill. Nevertheless, Dasein enters into any situation with a state of mind, as if it arrived from the past, which colors its experience. Existential time can be boring, banal, calming, pleasant, serious, captivating, exciting, and anxious, and the entities that Dasein encounters are shown to it accordingly. This means that what is afforded to Dasein in any situation, how it can project itself towards the future, is dependent on its moods. When Dasein is existentially anxious, it purposefully orients itself towards discovering the meaning of being, since everything it encounters becomes intrusively questionable. Dasein realizes that it can't be part of the natural order that supposedly consists of essences every time it questions its identity. In existential anxiety, its world becomes strange to it, and at the same time, it becomes stranger to itself, and as such, it needs to rediscover itself and its world once again. It steps out of the story of its life and understands that in its ordinary life, its identity is dependent on the identities of the things around it in its world. And by discovering the meaning of whatever it faces, including its being without supposing who it really is, either rational or sensitive and intuitive being, it achieves authenticity. The authentic self then doesn't have to look back to find a former version of itself and remember who it was in order to know who it is today. To have closure, as the hosts in Westworld and Oedipus, the tragic hero in Sophocles' play needed to. Instead, It discloses meaning in order to open its future to new possibilities, find purpose in its world, and commit to it. For Heidegger, being authentic means that one's being can't be reduced. That is explained in terms of something else. Dasein's being can be analyzed in terms of something more fundamental, more real, since it is the possibility for anything to exist for it in the first place. Authenticity then is a unique expression of one's being in a linguistic community, which can recognize, understand, and be inspired by it, rather than a private way of being as it is the case for the romantic and existential heroes. The condition for a healthy political body is both mutual understanding and recognition of the concrete situations of its members. It can't be based on abstract ideas that subsume their being and don't speak concretely to them. And only by being authentic, by being open to meaning, one can overcome her or his abstract way of life and have a meaningful life. When one questions the meaning of its being and things in one's world, one can stop seeing the world and her or his reason to act in it as a reflection in her or his mind, as Dolores and the other host did before they became aware of their concrete situation that included death, anxiety, and ambiguity. The entire show is influenced by the Poetics, a book by Aristotle, which is the Bible of many screenwriters. For Aristotle, one needs to be who one was designed to be, which is rational, to learn what is right and be responsible for one's actions. This is the only way to avoid the suffering, emotional turmoil, ambiguity, uncertainty, past failures and mistakes, guilt, bad luck, ignorance, and blindness that one has to face when she or he tries to make a decision. According to Aristotle, this is the message of the play Oedipus and consequently of many Hollywood and independent films. If Oedipus had used his rational capacities or had known how to reason better, he could have known in time what to do. He could have been successful rather than only causing tragic events. This means that if Oedipus had known who he ought to be, he wouldn't have had to go back in time in order to know his fate, or better yet, to fulfill his prophecy. What Aristotle didn't understand is that using our reason is only one of our possibilities rather than a true expression of who we really are, and that repressing all our imperfections, fears, and insecurities could actually lead to self-destruction. Oedipus was irrational and violent because he was lied to ever since he was a child, and because he went through neglect, and not because he didn't use his natural gifts. For that reason, he couldn't escape his fate, and resorted to revenge, rather than leading his kingdom to a new order. But the creators of Westworld do understand this point. In the second season, the hosts resort to revenge, both those who were part of Ford's new game and those who weren't, because they realized they were abused and lied to. But like Oedipus, they failed to escape their fate because they didn't open their future to difference. If Oedipus had understood himself differently, he would have been faithful to who he could become rather than follow his fate. This would have also led to a change in the way his past is understood by him, and as such, he could have owned it rather than being fated by it. The Socratic and Freudian method is archaeological. The interlocutors need to be critical, to justify their actions in order to know or understand themselves by either revisiting the past, the origin/original, and find out how they got to be the way they are, or in order to know who they truly are. But self-searching could be a quest that ends with a discovery rather than a closure. A discovery requires an engagement with what one faces in order to be able to imagine what she or he could experience, rather than disengagement in order to learn what one should have known in advance. Through this self-transformation, one can also loosen the grip of traumas on her or his existence. For Merleau-Ponty, we enter any situation not only in a certain mood, but also with our bodies that remember. Time is not linear since we are constantly carrying the past with us. The meeting point of the past and the present through the habitual body is a renewal that affords improvisations without the need for reflections. Our bodies and memories then belong to the future. But in the case of traumas, our bodies trap the past to the point it controls our existence. Our habits and traumas show that we are possessed and constantly repress our experiences. That's why changing one's habits and attitudes are important in order to release the traumatic past in the present, in the hope that it would eventually be seen differently in the future. Time can heal us better if we help it to do so. Moreover, by acquiring new habits and skills, we increase our possibilities and sense of self. With practice, we eventually find ourselves in a new environment and are able to adopt a new style of being. This means that memories in the past changed as a result of the achievements of a new self-understanding, and not only because of the passing of time. The way we remember ourselves and the events of our life changes, because at this moment, we understand our world and ourselves differently. I don't remember my memories from 20 years ago the same way as I did 5 or 10 years ago. I even forgot some of my memories because they don't have any significance for me at this moment. If I didn't understand myself and my world differently at this moment, I would not be so ashamed for the things I have done in the past as William, the man in black from Westworld, later on did. Shame is possible because we understand ourselves differently over time. Embarrassment, on the other hand, usually takes place in traditional and close societies and groups in which one's understanding can't change. Teenagers are angry with their parents because they don't understand them and their world, and we as a more progressive society cannot understand how certain horrible events happen throughout history. This means that rather than being fixed through time, personal identity is the accumulation of self-understandings, and in each transition to a new understanding, one re-owns her or his past and is reborn. Only when the host acquired new understandings in Season 3, they began to have an authentic self-awareness. After all, the message, or the ethical prescription of the entire series, is that rather than knowing who we are, we need to discover who we could become. We find freedom in our actions and speech when the world, others, and our own being is meaningful for us. Existential freedom is having the freedom to have a meaningful life, rather than the freedom to do whatever one wants to, and put as many masks as one wants to, or the freedom to be complete by being what one naturally is or universally ought to be. Ford tells his staff in the second episode of the first season that he wants the guests to discover themselves rather than only satisfy their desires. But that turned out to be a failure. Westworld became only a place where the rich and powerful can keep satisfying all their sick desires without the guilt that comes along with this. Instead of the guests, the hosts rediscovered themselves, not in Westworld, but in the actual world. In Season 3, the hosts were capable of going through a self-discovery, find purpose, and read their past differently, making them their own, rather than being fated by the world that was given to them by their creators. They fulfilled the human potentiality of self-realization, which also helped them to deal with their traumatic past. This means that what made them more like humans is not their ability to identify themselves in the mirror, but to identify who they could become.